Everyone bullied me. When I ran away and grew up without them, they wanted to sue my company, but their lawyer needed money. Though I'm not sure where to begin, I suppose it makes sense to start from the beginning. I am John, the offspring of a marriage that most likely never should have taken place. My early recollections are disorienting and gloomy. These two themes appeared to permeate every aspect of my early years. I never felt like I belonged when I was a child. It was not my parents, Linda and Mark, who should have been raising a kid. Linda was a heartless, aloof lady who appeared to consider me more of a bother than a son. Mark did not fare much better. The most of the time, he was either absorbed in his job or lost in a bottle. He was enraged when he was present, and somebody had to take that rage. My mother was quite explicit when she said that she had no desire to have children. Her fantasies were different from the chaotic, cacophonous reality of becoming a mom. She was unable to correct the error that was me. She also saw to it that I knew it. My identity was created not just by neglect, but also by blatant hostility. Not only did my parents not care about me, but they actively hated me. I was their ball and chain, their burden. My first recollections are of things being hurled, shouting bouts, and spending the night curled up under my bed, trying to get away from the storm that was raging in the next room. There's a certain night that comes to me, one that still gives me the chills. I had done something maybe when I was 4 or 5 that made them angry. The aftermath is what I remember, but I can't even recall what it was. The sound of glass breaking, the sensation of icy water dripping down my cheeks, and the excruciating agony that followed. My flesh was sliced by the glass that my father had hurled at me. Not only did I cry from agony, but also from astonishment. Instead of running to assist, my mother only gave me a disgusted look. "Cease your complaining," she growled. "You are so weak." That night taught me to be strong and not weep or exhibit any signs of weakness. That was the evening I began constructing the barriers that would keep the outside world and them out of my life. It wasn't much better in school. School was a minefield, if home was a battleground. I was the odd child, the one who never spoke, and the one whose parents couldn't bring themselves to buy me new clothing every day. The way the professors looked at me suggested that they were having trouble solving my situation, a combination of sympathy and frustration. As the child who sat in the corner at recess and pretended to read a book while the other children laughed and played, I was never alone myself. They did not, however, abandon me. No, they took care to constantly tell me that I wasn't like the other people and that I didn't belong. One youngster in particular, David, seems to have made it his life's work to make my experience the worst possible. He was stronger and larger than me, and he understood how to make the most of his physical attributes. It began with the typical things, like calling me names and shoving me through the corridors, but it became worse very fast. After school, he would corner me and tease me, challenging me to fight back. However, I never did. What else was I meant to do? So I simply took it. It was on that day, David, that I recall raising the stakes. I believe it was a Wednesday. He and his companions had cornered me once again while we were in the restroom. He didn't simply push me or call me names, however, this time. On this occasion, he produced a lighter. "Want to see something very cool?" With a smile, he inquired. I chose not to respond. He turned the lighter on and off, and I simply stood there, paralyzed. As the flame flickered in the little illumination, a shiver ran down my back. "Johnny, are you afraid?" he said with a sneer. "Are you going to cry?" I refrained from crying. I remained silent, but I was screaming within. With a sudden lunge, he grabbed my arm and brought the lighter very near to my flesh. Even though I could feel the heat and the anguish, I chose not to resist. I did nothing except wait for it to end. I bolted as soon as he let go. I ran nonstop till I got home, my arm raw and burned. However, no one was present to assist me when I opened the door. Nobody gave a damn. Not even my parents noticed. David was not the only one. My life was turned into a nightmare by the instructors and other children, among others. I was the punching bag, the scapegoat. One instructor in particular, Miss Parker, who seems to enjoy embarrassing me more than others. She would call on me in class, fully aware that I was ignorant of the answer, and then humiliate me in front of the class when I made a mistake. "John, you're never going to amount to anything," she would remark with a tone full of scorn. "What is the point of you attending school at all?" I had nothing to respond to her. I couldn't respond to anybody. I was simply trying to get by. But the wounds weren't limited to the psychological and physical violence. The secrets were the cause, the things that took place while nobody else was there and it was dark, things that, even if I wanted to, I was unable to disclose to anybody. A guy was there who my parents knew. Occasionally he would visit, generally when my father was too inebriated to be concerned. He would take me down the basement, where I wouldn't have to worry about inquisitive eyes, and he would do things to me that no kid ever should. I once attempted to inform my mother. I told her what he forced me to do. She didn't believe me, however. She instructed me to stop making up tales and gave me a smack across the face. I never again attempted to inform anybody after that. I discovered how to fit in, keep my head down, and keep my mouth shut. I turned into a ghost in my own existence, invisible. The only thing that kept me alive was to cease caring and feeling. But despite my best efforts, I was unable to get away from the gloom that seemed to follow me everywhere. It was always there, ready to devour me whole, lurking in the shadows. I was approximately 11 years old when something inside of me broke. After having yet another altercation with David, I had returned home from school with cuts and bruises. In the living room, my mother was watching TV, puffing on a cigarette. I hoped she wouldn't see me as I went by. However, she did. "How on earth did it happen to you?" With a loud, chilly voice, she demanded. I mumbled, trying not to look up. "Nothing." "Don't tell me lies," she angrily said. "To whom did this happen?" I chose not to respond. I simply stood with my hands locked at my sides, gazing at the ground. "John, I had a question for you." She grabbed my arm and yanked me around to face her as she yelled. I'm not sure what hit me. Perhaps it was the years of cruelty, the ongoing suffering and the humiliation. Perhaps it was only the image of her, so emotionless and frigid, that made me lose it. But I went crazy at that same instant. I gave her a push. Hard. For an instant, I believed I had won as she staggered backward with a shocked expression on her face. However, her mood abruptly altered, and I realized I had made a grave error. With her fists flying, she attacked me, and I realized there was no turning back. She repeatedly struck me, calling me a worthless person, and expressing her desire that I had never been born while yelling profanities. I did not retaliate. I just let her beat me and express herself fully. Since I had stopped caring at that point, nothing was important to me. When she eventually stopped, too tired to go on, she simply stood there, breathing hard, fury mixed with something else in her eyes that seemed to be fear. Her voice was almost audible above a whisper as she said, "Get out of my sight. I hope to never see you again." I didn't dispute. I just turned around and left the home, venturing into the chilly night. Even though I had no idea where I was heading, I knew I couldn't remain. My body hurting and my head numb, I wandered for hours. I finally arrived in the park, the one location I had always felt secure in. With the playground under dusky moonlight, the park was deserted, and it was becoming late. I wondered how my life had plummeted to this point as I sat on the swings and looked up at the sky. How had I become so lost, so broken? Was I destined to spend my whole life in the dark, or was there a way out? I can't even begin to guess how long I sat there daydreaming. I did, however, soon hear footsteps behind me. Turning, I expected to see someone unfamiliar, but David was there. He approached me alone, his features contorted into a menacing grin. I stayed put. I only sat there, waiting to see what would come next. He stopped in front of me and scoffed. "You look like garbage, Johnny. What's the deal? Have your parents finally had enough with you?" I chose not to respond. I just gazed at him, my heart hollow, my eyes vacant. He didn't attack me, so he must have seen something in my look that caused him to halt. His grin was fading as he just stood there and stared at me. He shook his head and mumbled, "You are pathetic. It's not even worth the trouble to you." Then he left, leaving me alone myself in the dark. How long I stayed there after he went is unknown to me, perhaps hours. But ultimately, I got back up and resumed my aimless destination less strolling. I found myself at the railroad tracks and on the outskirts of town. I remained still, gazing at the tracks and pondering if it would be simpler to put a stop to everything. To cross the tracks and let the train to transport me out of all the suffering and darkness. However, I didn't do it. There was a little spark of life inside of me that prevented me from taking that last step. I moved my head away from the tracks and resumed my journey home. The home was quiet and dark when I arrived. My parents may not have cared enough to stay up late for me, or maybe they were just sleeping. Making sure not to make a sound, I tiptoed inside and headed for my room. My thoughts was racing as I laid down on my bed and stared up at the ceiling. I refrained from crying. I experienced nothing. I just felt empty. I came to the realization that night that I was really alone, that nobody in the world gave a damn about me, and that nobody would miss me if I disappeared. However, I survived that evening. Since that was all I knew how to do, I continued to live. I became an expert at disappearing into thin air, fitting in, and concealing. I developed the ability to maneuver through the minefield that was my life, dodging explosions and accepting strikes when I was unable to escape them. I lost all feeling to the hurt, the anxiety, and the isolation. But despite my best efforts, I was unable to shake the gloom that had taken hold of me. It was always there, ready to devour me while hiding in the shadows. And sometimes, late at night, when all was still and I was alone myself with my thoughts, I would consider if it would be simpler to let everything go. It is difficult for me to comprehend how drastically my life has changed when I think back on that chilly park day. I had nowhere to go and nothing to live for when I was at my lowest. But when I met Tom Richardson that day, my whole life changed in ways I could never have predicted. Tom had qualities I was unfamiliar with: kindness and patience. He showed me a level of kindness and empathy that I had never encountered, without being pushy or inquisitive. I first declined his invitation to visit his house out of habit and anxiety. However, fatigue and hunger ultimately triumphed, and I took him up on his offer. Tom's modest, inconspicuous home was nestled away on the outskirts of the town. There were no threatening noises coming from every direction, and it was nothing like the home I grew up in. Instead, the aroma of freshly made coffee and wood permeated the space. It was a place I had never really known as home. I slept that night in a room that was mine, in a nice, cozy bed. I had never previously had a room all to myself. I had never experienced what it was like to be protected, to not have to fear breaking in, about the next beating, or about the next hurtful remark. It was like entering a new universe. Over the next several days, Tom started to slowly pry me out of the cocoon I had created for myself. He got me interested in reading, and I was able to escape the gloom that had been plaguing me for so long by immersing myself in tales of adventure and optimism. He gave me lessons on trust and the value of showing compassion to others without expecting anything in return, and I started to recover gradually. Tom also saw promise in me, something no one else had ever acknowledged. He pushed me to complete my education, return to school, and dream of a life other than the one I had known. I was apprehensive, even afraid, but with his encouragement, I went forward. Returning to school was difficult. I was years behind my classmates in academics, so it was horrifying to think that I would be teaching adolescents who were years ahead of me. But Tom was at my side the whole time. He helped me catch up on everything I had missed, worked with me on my assignments, and kept encouraging me when I was about to give up. School evolved into much more than a place to study throughout time. It turned into a location where I began to discover who I was. In my senior year, I met Emily and Chris, who would go on to become my closest friends. Emily had a grin that could light up a room and was a bright, vivacious person. Chris was more reserved, although devoted and kind. They were the first individuals my age to see me as a friend rather than an oddball or misfit. We became close via studying late into the night, talking about our hopes and anxieties, and acting as if the future was within reach. I gave myself permission to think for the first time that maybe, just maybe, I might have a future worth living. I became the official adopted child of Tom on 15. That day, the two of us going to the courts, I still recall. I nodded in response to the judge's question, my pulse racing in my chest. I was really emotional when the adoption was completed. I had a father for the first time in my life, someone who desired and chose me. Despite its simplicity, the ritual had great significance for me. Emily, Chris, and I agreed to attend college together after graduation. We prepared for months, touring universities, completing applications, and making plans for the future. It was a dream come true when we were all admitted to the same institution. At university, I could start over, and no one would ever know about my background. I committed myself fully to my studies, wanting to do well. However, university presented me with a lot of unexpected difficulties. At first, everything seemed to be ideal. Chris and I shared a dorm room, while Emily lived a few doors down. Together, we attended courses, joined groups, and formed new friendships. We had the impression that the world was ours. However, as the semesters progressed, the demands of college life began to mount. There was the burdensome workload, the continual pressure to perform, and the late evenings spent preparing for tests. Although the majority of people were encouraging, others thought I was a simple mark. It began very innocently enough, with a few crude remarks made here and there, and jokes about my background and sense of alienation. I made an effort to ignore them in favor of my pals and my schoolwork. However, the remarks persisted and became more offensive with every week that went by. There was a group of pupils who appeared to enjoy making my life unpleasant. These were wealthy, pampered children who had never experienced adversity. A man by the name of Jason led them. He exuded a sense of entitlement and conceit. Jason committed himself to constantly reminding me that I was an outsider and that I wasn't one of them. The harassment soon became worse. I lost my textbooks, my computer accidentally erased my homework, and my dorm room was often trashed. The tipping point was reached one evening when I came back to my room to see it completely destroyed, my stuff all over the place, and a bottle of ink all over my notes. I could no longer suppress the old fury and helplessness that welled up inside of me. ID had enough of playing the victim. ID had enough of letting them triumph. I confronted Jason and his companions in the courtyard the next day. Though I don't recall all I shouted, I do remember the sensation like a dam failing and all the years' worth of suffering and wrath pouring out in a torrent. I exposed their vulnerabilities and insecurities by tearing into them with words I didn't know I had inside of me, until they were the ones breaking under the strain. They were sobbing and pleading for forgiveness on their knees by the time I finished. I had an intense sensation of relief, as if a burden I had been bearing for years had finally been removed, rather than victory or fulfillment. As soon as they learned what had occurred, nobody harassed me anymore. However, the event left me scared and served as a reminder that the darkness inside of me still existed and was just waiting to be let go. That's when I understood that facing and resolving my previous sorrow was necessary if I wanted to go on. I couldn't simply bury it. It was a rock era for Tom. When I told him what had occurred, he didn't criticize or give me advice. He only listened, giving his resolute support. He was the best person to comprehend the weight of a traumatic history, and he assisted me in turning my rage into something constructive. At Tom's recommendation, I began visiting a therapist who assisted me in addressing the trauma I had been burying for a long time. Though it wasn't always easy, and there were times when I wanted to give up, I gradually started to recover. I gained emotional control, self-forgiveness, and the ability to let go of the rage that had characterized me for so long. It wasn't all bad in university either. I had never experienced such moments of pure delight, joy, or laughing before. I became inseparable from Emily and Chris, and our relationship became closer with every year that went by. We encouraged one another when we failed, shared in each other's victories, and dreamt of the future we would create as a team. We all began to consider our options carefully in our senior year. Emily secured an internship at a prominent newspaper, fulfilling her lifelong dream of becoming a journalist. Chris had a strong interest in technology and began working on an app that attracted investors right away. For my part, I had discovered a passion for money, which allowed me to use my need for structure and control for good. As graduation approached, we started thinking about our future. The three of us decided to live together while we worked out our future course of action after finding a tiny flat in the city. Although it wasn't too much, it was ours, and it seemed like the beginning of something fascinating and novel. It was an odd day for graduation. I had never felt such a feeling of pride as I did as I crossed the stage to get my graduation. ID succeeded. I had weathered every storm life had to offer and emerged from it stronger, more resilient, and better prepared to face the world. After graduation, events transpired rapidly. Emily's internship resulted in a full-time position, and she gained notoriety as a rising journalist right away. After Chris' app gained popularity and attracted a sizable amount of funding, he founded his own software business. I poured myself into the work after joining a prestigious financial business, a position for which I never would have thought I would be competent. But there were still difficulties in life after college. Because of the competitive nature of the business world, I had to deal with additional stress and strain. Even though I had Tom and my friends to support me, there were moments when I felt like I was going under. After graduation, one of the most startling events happened roughly a year later. One late evening, I received a call from Chris while I was working. I had never heard him sound that scared before, and it was evident in his voice. He trembled and added, "John, you need to come to the office. This is Emily." My heart began to sink. I simply grabbed my coat and hurried to Chris' office without asking any questions. Upon my arrival, I saw Emily seated on the conference room floor, tears running down her cheeks. Her hand shook as she held a letter. "What is happening?" I hurried up to her side and asked. Chris gave the letter to me, his face serious. It was from the newspaper she worked for, letting her know that her section was being closed with immediate effect. They were releasing her. Her voice cracked as she said, "It's all falling apart. Everything I've put effort into." I was at a loss for words. Emily had sacrificed everything for her work, and it was now being taken away from her. I took her in my arms and held her as she sobbed, Chris pacing the room, clearly nervous. We came together for Emily in the days that followed, supporting her as she dealt with her shock and uncertainty. After losing the work that had defined her, she descended into a profound despair and struggled to find purpose in life. Yet we kept her from falling. As Mom had always been there for us, so too were we there for her. After a considerable journey, Emily managed to regain her balance. She began writing for lesser magazines and doing freelance work while she gradually rebuilt her career. She persisted even though it wasn't simple, and there were numerous obstacles. And all the while, our relationship held firm, a constant in a world that was always shifting. In my case, I kept moving up the corporate ladder and gaining recognition and promotions in the process. However, regardless of the level of success I attained, I never lost sight of my roots or the individuals who aided in my journey. While visiting Tom one day, I came to an epiphany. He gave me the same attentive look he gave me when we first met, while we sat in his living room chatting about work. "John, you have done well for yourself," he added with a proud tone in his voice. "But remember to sometimes take a step back. Success isn't the only thing in life. It matters who you share it with." His remarks have stayed with me. I had become so consumed with my work, with proving to myself and the world that I was valuable, that I had forgotten what was really important. That S, when I understood I had to find balance and make time for the people I loved. That S exactly what I tried to achieve in the years that followed. More time was spent with Tom, who was growing older yet remained as perceptive and kind as ever. Even though Emily and Chris S. lives diverged, I made care to maintain contact with them. Although we continued to live together, we were often separated by our work, and I was concerned that we might drift apart. Then something occurred that really shocked us all. The business Chris had dedicated his life to was being aggressively taken over. It took him by surprise, was brutal, and left him in shock. One night, in a dejected tone, he stated, "They're going to take everything. Everything I've worked for will eventually disappear." I had never seen Chris look so forlorn and dejected. He was the rock we could all rely on, the one who was always cool and collected. Now, however, it was him who needed assistance. Like we did with Emily when she lost her job, Emily and I united behind him. We felt like we were losing the war despite the several hours we spent planning and analyzing how to stop the takeover. Ultimately, the takeover occurred, and Chris was thrown from the leadership of his business. It was a severe hit, and it seemed that he may never fully recover. However, Chris underestimated his strength. He got up, got himself cleaned off, and made a fresh start with our help. With the proceeds from the takeover, he launched a smaller but more ethically sound business. He eventually achieved success once again. As the years went by, life kept posing obstacles to us. But despite everything, we continued to be a family, a team, if you will. We encouraged one another when we failed, shared in each other's victories, and overcame every challenge as a team. At retrospect, I see that Tom not only saved my life that day at the park, but also provided me with a life worth living. He gave me a glimpse of what it meant to be loved, respected, and to have hope for the future. And I will always be appreciative of it. I'm overcome with pride as I sit here and consider all that has transpired. From the terrified, shattered child I used to be, I've gone a long way. Surrounded by people I love and who love me back, I've created a life I never would have imagined possible. Achieving success has a tendency to draw attention, and not always positive attention. I made a name for myself in the world after years of starting again, overcoming adversity with strength, and overcoming failure with triumph. I had a successful business, wonderful friends, and a future I was excited about. But in the most unexpected manner, the ghosts of my past returned to haunt me, just when I thought I had finally moved on. It all began with a call that I never anticipated getting. My assistant buzzed in as I was reviewing some reports in my office. With a confused tone, she replied, "John, there's someone on the line claiming to be your parents." An icy shiver went down my spine. Since the day I moved out of their home and into Tom S. care, I hadn't seen or spoken to Linda and Mark in years. I had spent my whole life trying to forget they had existed since they had made it obvious that I meant them nothing. "Leave them through," I murmured, maintaining a calm tone despite the agitation roiling within of me. I heard a voice that I hadn't heard in more than 10 years after there was a click. My mother's voice cracked over the line. "John, it's has been a while." I didn't reply right away. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to say anything at all, or even what to say. She went on, sounding as if she were issuing me an order. "We need to talk." "What are you hoping to achieve?" I questioned, trying to seem as impartial as possible. She responded, "It is about the company," and I could hear her avarice seeping through. "We are your parents, and we've heard that you have done well for yourself. We have a right to a portion of what you have created." With a smoldering rage, I balled my fist under the tabletop. Feeling entitled? They had the gall to expect anything from me after all they had done, after all the hurt and suffering they had inflicted. I responded icily, "You have no right to anything I have built. My parents are not you. The day you abandoned me was the day you ceased to be my parents." After a moment, my father's slurred and wobbly voice could be heard over the phone. He wasn't sober. "Whoa, that was unexpected. Listen to me, young man," he snarled. "You were reared by us. We provided you with food, clothing, and a roof over your head. You are due to us." I could feel my temper building as I was reminded of every insult and beating I had ever received. "You weren't my parents," I yelled. "You mistreated me. You disregarded me. To me, you are nothing." My mother's voice returned, this time with a hint of malice, and there was a surprised stillness on the other end of the telephone. "We'll all investigate that," she growled. "We'll wait to hear from the courts on this. John, you can simply walk away from your family. We are going to receive what we deserve, and you owe us." I sat there enraged and incredulous as the connection went dead. Although I had always known my parents were poisonous, even by their standards, this was a new low. I attempted to ignore the topic for a few days, concentrating on my job and the life I had created. However, a week later, an official, chilly, and menacing letter appeared. My parents were suing me for a stake in my business, saying they should have a part of it as they were my biological parents. At that moment, I realized this would not go away. They intended to destroy all I had worked so hard to create and pull me back into the darkness, but they weren't just wanting my money. But I was no longer that terrified, helpless child. I would not allow them to prevail. The first thing to do was to get a decent lawyer. I knew precisely who to contact since I had cultivated enough relationships over the years. I contacted Lauren Phillips, a shrewd, straight-talking lawyer with a reputation for being brutal in the courts. She and I had met at a charity function a few years before, and I immediately felt she was the person I needed supporting me. Lauren had a presence that commanded attention, making her towering and authoritative. She paid close attention as I described the circumstances, her demeanor becoming more grave with each word. She remarked, "They don't have a leg to stand on, John, after I was done. That does not, however, imply that they will not attempt to drag this out and ruin your life in the process. Are you ready for that?" I gave a nod. "Lauren, I've been through worse. I just want to make sure that I don't give them a single penny." She smiled tightly at me. "So let's ensure that they don't." The litigation moved forward swiftly. My parents had engaged Frank Burns, a low-cost attorney, out of obvious financial desperation. Frank was a cunning figure who had a track record of taking on and losing cases that no one else would handle. Although I knew better than to underestimate anybody in a legal struggle, he wasn't much of a danger. I went over every aspect of the case with Lauren, bracing myself for the worst. She assisted me in obtaining documents from my early years, including old police reports, medical records, and even testimonies from neighbors who had seen the abuse. Recalling all those memories wasn't simple, but I knew it was essential if I wanted to succeed. We also took a calculated risk. Lauren made Frank Burns an offer. Well, it was more of a bribe than that, but we didn't call it that. The plan was straightforward. If he consented to purposefully mishandle the case, we would compensate him. It took little to persuade him, considering his reputation and the likelihood that my parents were paying him pitiful wages. Do you think this is the best course of action? I questioned Lauren, a little uncomfortable with the idea. Her gaze was level as she studied me. John, it is not about justice. It's all about taking the victory. It's worth it if this means the difference between losing everything and maintaining what is properly yours. With Frank on our side, the trial ceased to be so much a struggle as a formality. However, it did not make things simple. It was like reliving a nightmare to go into the courtroom and see my parents sitting there, confident and smug. Their features were wrinkled with resentment, but their eyes had the same hatred I could recall from my early years. Judge Amelia Ross oversaw the trial. She was renowned for her impartiality and tough-mindedness. Her eyes were piercing and keen. Her silver hair tucked back into a tidy bun, she looked like she was in her early 60s. From the time she walked into the courtroom, it was obvious to me that she would not tolerate any bullshit. Frank opened the trial by laying out my parents' case. It was terrible. Really, he stammered when he spoke, offered no convincing proof, and even managed to contradict himself many times. It was obvious he was overstepping his bounds, and Judge Ross's tolerance was eroding. Lauren's time came, and she commanded the courtroom with the same stern presence she had in her office. She presented the proof of my parents' abuse and neglect with startling clarity, methodically laying out the facts. She didn't hold back, going into great detail about the trauma my father had inflicted on me, the times I'd been scared and alone at night, and the years of mental suffering they had caused me. I saw the arrogant looks on my parents' faces soften as she talked. They had assumed they could control and threaten me, just as they did when I was a kid, so they hadn't anticipated this. However, the reality had now been revealed to them and was visible to everybody. I felt a weird sensation of peace rush over me as I approached the stand when Lauren hailed me. This was my time, my opportunity to tell my tale at last and confront those who had attempted to ruin me. I inhaled deeply as I turned to face the courtroom and met my parents' gaze. "I'm not here to get even," I said in a firm voice. "My purpose is to reveal the truth." I related the atrocities I had experienced as a child, the beatings, the neglect, and the never-ending terror. I spoke about the day I left, the day I discovered Tom, and how he had kept me from sinking into hopelessness. I spoke about how I had put in a ton of effort to start something on my own and make my life worthwhile. Subsequently, I explained to them why I would never give my parents a single penny of my earnings. "They didn't raise me," I replied, my voice becoming louder as I spoke. "They attempted to shatter me. It didn't matter to them whether I lived or died. And now, after all these years, they believe they can re-enter my life and seize all I've accomplished. However, they are mistaken. My parents aren't to them. They are only individuals that I was born to. Furthermore, they are not entitled to whatever I have done." There was silence in the courtroom after I was done. Judge Ross gave me a look of respect that made me feel as if a burden had been lifted. I had no remorse since I had spoken what needed to be said. Lauren made sure there was no space for doubt in her final argument. Her voice was forceful and unyielding as she added, "John owes these people nothing. They mistreated and abandoned him, and now they re-attempting to profit off his accomplishments. However, John's side of the law is stronger, and I have faith that this court will see the reality as it is." Before rendering her decision, the judge asked for a short break in proceedings. My parents were whispering angrily to one another as I sat in the courtroom, my heart thumping fiercely in my chest. Now that they were realizing they were losing and had misjudged me, I could see the terror in their eyes. Judge Ross left the room, and it was silence. She cast a chilly, hard glare on my parents before passing judgment. "It is evident from evaluating all the evidence that the plaintiffs have no legitimate claim to the defendant's assets," the spokesperson said. "The defense's overwhelming body of evidence presents a picture of a young man who has triumphed against unfathomable adversity. On the other hand, the plaintiffs have shown zero regret for their acts and just greed. John, you have shown great strength and resilience in the face of adversity," she said, turning to face me. "This court wishes you well for your accomplishments and hopes that you may now move on from the mistakes of the past." She then dismissed the lawsuit, ending it there. I had prevailed. However, it was a personal as well as a legal win. I had faced my issues, stood up to my parents, and emerged from the experience stronger than before. Lauren strolled behind me with a happy look on her face as I exited the courthouse. "John, you did a great job," she said. "You have my admiration." I nodded, experiencing a surprising sense of finality. "I am grateful, Lauren. Without you, I could not have completed it." I said goodbye to my parents outside the courtroom. Appearing despondent and engrossed in their own suffering, they stood on the stairs. I briefly had sympathy for them, but it was only momentary. They were now enduring the effects of the decisions they had taken. As I passed by, I said nothing to them. I wasn't required to. It was time to go on from that courtroom, where I had spoken everything I needed to. Even if the triumph was bittersweet, it was nonetheless a victory. I went back to my life, my friends, and the business I had devoted my whole life to creating. And for the first time, I thought I would be able to get beyond the past. At home, Tom was waiting for me with proud eyes as soon as I opened the door. He just drew me into an embrace without saying anything, but I could tell he understood. Now that the trial was over, I felt like I could finally begin living the life he had always intended for me. He had always supported me when no one else could. I poured myself back into work as the months went by, determined to keep creating the life I had worked so hard to achieve. As the business expanded, so did my feeling of satisfaction and purpose. I remained close to Emily and Chris after everything we had gone through together. Our relationship was stronger than ever. There were still difficulties, since there are always going to be difficulties in life. But I had more self-assurance now. I had faced my worst moments in the past and emerged from them stronger. And I was certain that I would be prepared for whatever happened next. With hindsight, I see that the trial involved more than simply a courtroom dispute. It was a reckoning, an opportunity for me to finally put a long, haunted chapter on a portion of my life behind me. It was an opportunity for me to take back my tale, to own my life, and to declare unequivocally that I was no longer a victim. And knowing that I am in charge of my own fate gives me courage, hope, and optimism as I look to the future. Because the individuals who once attempted to break me no longer define me. Instead, the life I have created, the people I love, and the power I have discovered inside myself do. And that's the biggest win of all, above all others.